roads, storm sewers, water lines, all that still has to be maintained. Billions and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in this county still have to be maintained, and that's a tax that's put on the people. The people have to pay stormwater tax now. They have to obviously pay those other taxes. And as you'll see, the property values don't support that at this time, and obviously the problems that have happened that we're all aware of. Incidentally, in 2014, the population is down to 1.2 million. So not only has it not stayed the same with all that infrastructure we maintain, the population is now shrinking, and people are moving externally from the county, which is bad news for those communities. So this is what we call urban sprawl. This is the definition of urban sprawl. Describes expansion of human populations away from central urban areas into low-density, monofunctional, usually residential, car-dependent communities. So people are driving. People are driving from Lake County and Geauga County and Summit County and all these places to get to Cleveland still, but they don't live there. And that's a problem. That's a problem for a lot of reasons, most of which include the infrastructure it takes to get those people from one place to another. That doesn't necessarily have to happen. So what are the signs of urban sprawl? Well, in an inner ring community, you're looking at abandoned industrial commercial buildings, abandoned residential buildings, infrastructure collapses. This is in Cleveland. You're looking at crime that's happening that you see in these communities. Every time you see something bad that happens on the news, it's happening in a boarded up house, an abandoned commercial building. These are huge problems for the community on a lot of levels, not just from a crime standpoint. You see increased taxes. This is don't rain on our parade. This is a protest for the stormwater tax. There's billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure that have to be maintained that weren't accounted for when residential development happened, and now those things need to be paid for. The communities have no choice. There's EPA mandates to make these things happen, and all that falls on the burden of the communities. So because of land use planning, because of improper development, we have problems that are economic based. And then in the school system, as all these things happen and people leave and property values drop, tax revenues drop, and school systems don't have enough money. People decide, I don't want to have my kids grow up in that community, and they move out a ring. And then this ring has happened. It's like almost like a bomb exploding. So where'd they go? Guess what? This is Geauga County, 1975. This is the residential development in Geauga County. This is very similar to Lake County as well. 2000, here's the residential development in 2000. The western edge of the county has pretty much lost all of its farmland. There are some token horse farms and agro-tourism places like Patterson's here, but this isn't a farming community anymore. This was a farming community apparently before my time, but it's not anymore. Places like Bainbridge, Russell, you're losing the farming community aspects now in Newberry, in the second tier over. Auburn Township is becoming wildly developed. So these are problems that are happening here in Geauga County, and again, this is because of the shift in population from Cuyahoga County over to places like Lake County and Geauga County. And again, they go west too, Medina and Lorraine as well. So here's the signs of urban sprawl in our community. I live here in Chesterland. I drive around and I see the signs every October. They pop up and tell us what urban sprawl problems are happening. So we've got schools that are losing revenue. We've got schools that have too much, are gaining too many students, and the class sizes are getting up to 30 and 40. The community that I grew up in, which was Painesville Township, Riverside High School, they are at a point now where they finally did pass a levy, but they were at a point where they had 35, 40 kids in a class. They had 4 or 5 study halls a day. They didn't have gym. They didn't have band. They didn't have shop class anymore because they couldn't afford to do those things. It was $2,000 for a kid to play a sport. Not every kid can play a sport when it's $2,000. These are the cuts they had to make. And when people that are having kids, people that are my age, are looking at where they're going to raise their family, the number one thing we looked at was schools. The number two thing, and maybe I'm biased, that was open space access, but that is statistically one of the most important things people look at is access to open space, access to parks, bike paths, things like that. So schools and open space are what modern communities need if they want to attract people that are, taxpayers and raising kids. So We also have, police officers. Every time you put a new cul-de-sac in, you've got to police that street. You've got to plow that road. You've got to have a fire truck that goes down that street. Levies keep coming and coming. Property taxes go up. Pretty soon, property taxes get too high, and everybody moves over to Auburn. And then maybe they're going to Troy, and then maybe they're going to Parkman. And this is urban sprawl because they're moving away from high taxes, they're moving away from bad education systems or failing education systems, and they're moving towards open space and green space, and that's what folks want. So the point I'm trying to make here is that open space stabilizes the economic, open space protection will stabilize the community. And that comes in several forms. The one you're most familiar with is the park districts, but there's also privatized conservation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So farmland, here's another example of the economic importance of protecting open space. Farmland is a $105 billion with a B, billion-dollar industry in Ohio. That's 11.7% of all of our total domestic product is tied to farmland, and that includes regular corn and beans and dairy farms. It includes apples and orchards and vineyards and everything else is all tied to that farmland industry. Yet 95% of the farmland in Ohio is unprotected. And let's just take out the idealistic viewpoint of farmland's pretty and we want to protect it. 95% of our region's $105 billion industry is not protected. That's the point I'm trying to make here. The number of acres of farmland has dropped from 1935, 50%. So we have half as much farmland as we did in Ohio, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, but we're still not adamant about protecting that farmland. It's a very important aspect of our economy, and yet it goes unprotected. We're trying, but it's still not a focus of everybody on the state level. So why is it important? Well, another slide that I want you to remember tonight is my cost of community services slide. What this shows is revenue versus expenses, and this is tax dollars that come into a community. If your community is raising, for every dollar your community raises, it shows how much expenses that dollar attributes to certain land use types. Well, agriculture, for instance, for every dollar raised, it only uses 37 cents or 38 cents or 31 cents in services. So, a 100-acre farm doesn't have 60 kids that are going to go to the school system. It doesn't have 14 cul-de-sacs that need to be plowed, and doesn't have a lot of infrastructure and policing needs. So it doesn't use up as much as the tax dollar for the township. Industrial commercial development lands exactly where you think it would. There's a lot of income and revenue that comes from those. That's a healthy part of the community that needs to be in place for sure. But the important part of this slide is the residential development. So for every dollar raised in Auburn Township, for instance, the community loses 34 cents because they have to provide more services than that residential development provides. So they're forced to raise taxes. It forces them to eventually raise taxes. This happens in Auburn Township, happens in Madison, happens in Shalerville. This study's been repeated over and over. In Northeast Ohio, it's been repeated all across the country. The same thing happens. Residential development does not pay the bills. In fact, it costs the community. And that is an interesting aspect. So again, the protection of open space and or agricultural land is beneficial to insulating a community from its tax hikes that eventually will drive people away. So that's the bad news. Okay. So where do we start? The Land Conservancy has basically two tracks that it works down in terms of how we protect property and we protect these communities and try to revitalize some of the areas that have seen some hard times. Urban revitalization efforts through our Thriving Communities Institute, and then also our traditional land trust, land protection efforts that include a whole umbrella of different things. I'm going to talk about both of those right now. We're going to start with the urban stuff though. So in 2011, I believe, we hired this guy. His name is Jim Rokakis. He's a big personality. He was the former Cuyahoga County auditor, and he was at the forefront of the foreclosure crisis in the 2000s when he had his reign there. He understands this better than anybody, and he came to the Conservancy to try to implement an urban program that would stop and maybe fix some of the urban problems that had happened. Urban challenges, as everybody's aware, I would imagine predatory lending, deregulations of Wall Street and unscrupulous lenders that have caused the problems, loss of home equity and foreclosures. You know, these are things that people don't realize when you live on a street, and probably a lot of us don't, I don't, but if you live on a street and the neighbor's house gets boarded up and starts looking like this, your property value just lost $10,000. Just because of what they did, not because of anything you did. And everybody else's house on the street just lost $10,000. And if you have 10 houses on the street, that's $100,000 of value lost to that community because of one bad player. Well, think about what happens when you have half of the houses on your street that looks like this, or even more. Everybody loses value